Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to play a song while I get some stuff ready. So if it mutes out, just fast forward a minute or two because it's YouTube's copyright stuff.
Is proudly floating on the land and on the Maine. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. Beneath it off we've conquered and we'll conquer off again. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. Our Dixie forever, she's never ever lost. Down with the eagle and up with the cross. We will rally round the bonnie flag, we'll rally once again. The leaders in charge cry out, come boys, come. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. Our Dixie forever, she's never ever lost. Down with the eagle and up with the cross. We will rally round the bonnie flag, we'll rally once again. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. They have laid down their lives on the bloody battlefield. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. Their motto is resistance to the tyrants never yield. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. Our Dixie forever, she's never ever lost. Down with the eagle and up with the cross. We will rally round the bonnie flag, we'll rally once again. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom.
Okay, we're back. So let's go over some of these books here. At the top, we have the Sources of the American Republic. It's from 1971. That's a book where Charles Adams warns about the federal government becoming a corporation a few years before it happened. It's a good text. We're going to read from The Growth of the American Republic, 5th edition. This is like a 60s textbook. A lot of good stuff in there. We're going to read from The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer. This is about the Dulles brothers. And we're going to be focusing on the interwar period. And then we're going to read a little bit from Friedrich Nietzsche, because we're going to be talking a lot about philosophy, art, religion, and music in America after the fall of the South. What do we got here? Documents of American History. This is another 60s textbook. Classic. Let's look at our online stuff. So, this, of course, has floated around for a while, and there's no physical proof of its legitimacy, but it's alleging there was a communication between Albert Pike and this guy Mazzini, who was an Italian, Giuseppe Mazzini, in the 1800s, talking about the plan for 3 world wars. And everybody knows Albert Pike. Of course, we'll be reading a bit about him. We'll be talking about Aleister Crowley. We're pretty much going to be going from like 1900 to maybe after World War II. We'll see what happens today. So much happens during this time that we don't want to miss a lot. We're going to be talking about the Boston Brahmin. They're going to come up in some of our readings, which was a social group in New England. We're going to be taking a look at a 33-foot tall Masonic pillar gravestone I found in Rochester, and it belonged to a member of the Brahmin Society. Of course, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve. If you watched yesterday's episode, you got a little intro about Jekyll Hyde, which is where they came up with it. We're going to talk about the courts and Freemasonry. And this is a great little excerpt talking about the ways Freemasons identify themselves, judge and lawyer, secretly. This is the Quarterly Journal of Economics from February 1914, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So we're going to read a little bit about it. I never read it, just had it on my hard drive, so I'm not sure which angle they're going to be coming from. Doesn't really matter. This one is the opposition to the Federal Reserve Bank Bill by Carter Glass. Not sure when it was written. It comes from JSTOR, though. We'll be reading out of Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike a little bit. We will be looking at Carl Jung's, I'd say magnum opus, which this was a book he worked on his whole life, kind of secretly, never really let anybody in on it, and he did it in check this out, it's amazing. It's super blasphemous, warning you, say prayer before this episode, but the way he wrote this book is incredible. It's like medieval manuscript. I never knew about this. We're going to talk about media, the birth of media, the Tavistock Institute. We're going to talk about the radio, how important it was, and how right off the bat it was planned and used as a weapon to engineer society. We're going to talk about how war is a racket by Smedley Butler. If you don't know, 1933, I believe, a group of shadow government figures in the government asked this general right here to recruit the American Legion, which is like a veterans group, basically a lot of World War II veterans, World War I veterans. They have chapters all over the country, just like Freemasonry. I'm not sure if it's under the umbrella of Freemasonry, but it functions a little bit like it. And they wanted Smedley Butler to recruit the American Legion, 500,000 veterans, to overthrow the federal government. So yeah, we're going to be reading from his little book called War is a Racket, and it talks about, it gives all real examples of how much money people made, and he lays it out so simply. So this is where a lot of the families we've been talking about will come up, like the Astors, right? The DuPonts, and these are the families with houses on Mount Desert Island in Maine, big cottages that they built back in the day. Definitely Brahmin society type people, right? We got our Webster's 1886 dictionary on deck, of course. If you're new, you've never heard me say this before, this is about, how many pages? 1,938, Merriam-Webster from 1886. The modern Merriam-Webster has 720 pages. That's not good. So it's reduced by more than half of it. I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. You get it. It's very small compared to what it was. This is a good example of early predictive programming, The Wreck of the Titan. This was a fiction written about a beautiful boat that hits an iceberg called the Titan. I think it was 12 years before the Titanic sank. Bohemian Grove. We have this popping up in this time period. Of course, Helena Blavatsky and her influence on Western Hermeticism. We have groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn forming around this time. And, of course, the Ordo Templi Orientis, Aleister Crowley, actually have a temple. One of the official OTO temples, there's 30 or 40 in the country. One of them is in my city. I'll show you a video of it. It's gross. The Theosophical Society. We're going to talk about that. I'm sure you've heard of that before. The Lucius Trust, which I think was called the Lucifer Trust until people were like, you got to change that. But this is a organization involved with social engineering, pretty much. Then Henry Luce, Time Magazine. We're going to talk about him. Radio. And then I'm going to recommend this to you guys at some point. It's a wonderful channel that has great documentaries talking about the history of radio, television, and how these people all got together and planned out the social engineering in front of everybody's eyes. It's all documented. Yeah, his channel's called Days of Noah. And I think it's a 4-part documentary called How Media Shaped the Generations. And you want to start in the beginning, work your way up. So, in the last episode, we talked about the post-Civil War era reconstruction. So let's just go over a few points about that. before we start reading about the turn of the century. The South lost. They were under Reconstruction, which was military occupation for quite some time. In the decades after the Civil War, some of the big political things to happen were like the Homestead Act, where the government granted people land out west, and they really tried to push as fast and as far as they could to fill the country, which they did. Then there was a continuous battle between politicians over using a gold standard or a silver standard. Of course, they would go back and forth, but that pretty much all ends in 1913 in this episode today. So constant political battle about that, and constant political battle about commerce. How do we get these states to get along with one another? If there's a railroad going through 10 states and, is the railroad company paying the right amount of tax? Crazy stuff. So it's very confusing, but we looked into a lot of those Supreme Court cases where they eventually came up with the Interstate Commerce Act, which gave the federal government the ability to regulate commerce between states. And that, of course, kind of marks the beginning of the federal government's explosion and expansion. That's what happens in the decades after the Civil War. So now that the South is gone and the eagle has won and the cross has been defeated, it allows the Union to pretty much take control of society in the sense of philosophy, music, religion, art. So it's not that everybody believed in these things that we're going to talk about. It's that the Union and the people we always talk about, Freemasons, these ecumenical Christians, so-called Christians, the politicians, all these Union robber barons, they control the media. And we know that because in the anti-Masonic Party readings we read, written by our own founding fathers, they talk about this. By the 1830s, they already controlled all the press, the legislature, judicial, executive, all of it. So now that they're in control, basically, of everything, they start ushering in the esoteric mysticism, the speculative Freemasonry. They become very open about this stuff. And that's what happens around the year 1900. We have Bohemian Grove, we have Aleister Crowley and the Ordo Templi Orientis about to become big, and then all of this mysticism, and it's everywhere. That's why when we walk around the city of Portland, Maine, we can find buildings from that era with a horned devil carved into them in stone, or the Delano House with Lucifer painted underneath the doorway, right? So this is when all that became really popular. And that's why we're going to be reading Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, basically, he's a nihilist, and when I was a lefty in college back in the day, I used to love reading his books, but he basically explains the state of Christianity quite well when it comes to this post-Civil War, turn of the century Union. And it's nihilistic, the views that these people had. And yeah, basically the Freemasons were in complete power. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to read from the Masonic Bible, and we're going to read like the one-page bio of each president from the end of the Civil War until, I don't know, Harry Truman. And you'll find that almost every single one of them was a Freemason. And some of the ones that weren't Freemasons became Freemasons right away when they became president. So this book gives us insight, the Bible, because it talks exactly about what lodge they went to, what degree they achieved, all that stuff. So let's get into it. Okay. Let me move some stuff so I can actually try and show you this time. Sweet. Okay, big boy right here. So, I'll show the page to you. It's a very well-made book, I must say. That's Andrew Johnson. So yeah, each president, this was like a 1954 Bible. So all the Masonic presidents, I think there's like 13 up at this point, maybe more actually. Okay. Andrew Johnson, 17th president, April 15th, 1865 to March 4th, 1869. Andrew Johnson was advanced from the vice presidency to the presidency as a result of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the great Civil War president, who was re-elected in the fall of 1864. When he was inaugurated for his second term, Lincoln faced the gigantic task of rebuilding a nation that had been torn to shreds and devastated by 4 years of bitter civil war, in which the South had been literally wrecked and all but completely destroyed. How well Lincoln would have met and solved these challenges is a very difficult problem that nobody knows, but by his tragic death, they were passed on to Andrew Johnson. Thus, there was a thrust upon the shoulders of a man who had not been elected to the presidency, responsibilities and difficulties greater than those that ever rested upon any president of the United States. Johnson immediately found himself in conflict with the political leaders of the party that had elected him to the vice presidency. Soon there arose between himself and the Congress the bitterest sort of antagonism on many issues and a growing disagreement between himself and members of his cabinet. One legislative act after another passed by the Congress was vetoed by him, and in the course of events, many of them were enacted over his veto. His entire term was stormy and turbulent. He is the only president to ever face a trial of impeachment, but he was saved from that humiliation by the lack of only one vote against him. Yet historians are forced to recognize the fact that Andrew Johnson was a most remarkable man, and after all, he was perhaps the very type of man required for those years of Reconstruction. Advanced to the presidency by a chain of unique and apparently tragic providences, he must have been God's man for the most difficult period of American history. So, let me just say real quick, when they say advanced to the presidency by a chain of unique and apparently tragic providences, he must have been God's man for the most difficult period of American history. You have to understand that the Masonic God is Lucifer. The Masonic God is man. It's just themselves, right? So, these random occurrences that catapulted him to the presidency, they're not tragic providences. They're the creation of man. It's basically what they're saying right there. Like, we put together all those things that sent him to the presidency. Let's talk about his lodge and stuff. Andrew Johnson was made a master mason by the Greenville Lodge number 119, now number 3, in his adopted state of Tennessee. In 1851, when he was in the 43rd year of his life, he later received the degrees of Royal Archmason and Knight Templar, although the dates of these advancements are not known. From the time of his inception into the fraternity to his death, he was a lover of the craft and was active in the affairs of Freemasonry. He participated in many Masonic cornerstone layings and otherwise devoted much time to the work of Masonry throughout the nation. He was the only president who had the distinction of being made a Scottish Rite Mason while in office. The degrees were conferred upon him by duly authorized officers in the library of the White House on June 20th, 1867, following his death. July 31st, 1875, Johnson was buried with full Masonic honors by Greenville Lodge number 119. Think about that, guys. Right after the Civil War, mockery. They conferred Andrew Johnson's degrees upon him in the library of the White House. So they had just slaughtered the South and burned it to the ground. Remember, down with the eagle, up with the cross. So this stuff was not hidden, right? People knew about this. And then these people had the audacity to bring their ritualistic magic into the White House and make Andrew Johnson a Freemason. The South knew exactly what the Freemasons were doing and all about. There wasn't as much social engineering back then. There wasn't radio, telephone, smartphone, computers, right? So people were very keen to what was going on, I'd imagine. Okay, the next one is James Garfield, March 4th, 1881 to September 19th, 1881. They killed this guy. James Garfield was a man of great natural endowments, of sterling character, of superb qualities, and of unmeasured worth to his country. In the field of military accomplishments, as a statesman of sagacity and great ability, and as a leader in political councils, he served his country well and honorably over a period of nearly 25 years. He was famous as an orator, a debater, a writer, and withal was distinguished for his unswerving honesty and righteousness. He had little or no opportunity to display his abilities as an executive at the head of this great nation, since he was shot down by an assassin's bullet, July 2nd, 1881. That's an interesting date. The 4th of July is actually an occult holiday, so July 2nd, that's pretty damn close. It's a holiday about Sirius, the dog star, which ultimately represents Isis, the Egyptian goddess. Okay, that's why we blow up fireworks. It's a fire offer. It's a ritual, the 4th of July. We're paying a ritual to Sirius, the dog star, the representation of Isis, the Egyptian god. They're fire offerings. They're fire sacrifices. That's what fireworks are. It's crazy. Okay. Yeah, so they shot him. He had just begun to organize his administration and to outline its policies when his career was thus tragically ended. Hence, no one can appraise how well or how poorly he might have served his country as president. So he wasn't a Mason, I think. No, he was. In 1862, James Garfield was initiated and passed in Magnolia Lodge number 20 of Columbus, Ohio. Remember, it's not Columbus, it's Columbus. It's a god. It's not, named after Colombia. Well, Colombia is probably named after the same god. They name everything after gods. Okay, 1862, he was initiated. Due to his services in the Army, his advancement to the sublime degree of Master Mason was delayed for nearly 2 years. This degree was given to him, however, by Columbus Lodge number 30 of Columbus, Ohio, at the request of his mother lodge. On November 22, 1864, he was afterward an honorable member of Garrettsville Lodge number 246, where he served as chaplain in 1868 to 1869. He later became a charter member of Pentalpha Lodge number 23 of the District of Columbia. Wow. The District of Columbia didn't exist until 1871, so he became a member. The Pentalpha Lodge would have been established after 1871 too, so this is something active. These people literally in this book actively created the District of Columbia, the Corporation of the United States, this whole disgusting evil system. Wow. Okay. As a further evidence of Garfield's love for the craft and devotion to the principles of Freemasonry, he was exalted to the Royal Arch degree on April 18, 1866, in the Columbia Royal Arch Chapter number 1 of Washington, D.C. Later in the same year, he received the Red Cross and Templar orders in Columbia. Wow. So notice all these things are Freemasonry. The Rosy Cross, the Red Cross, right? Rosicrucianism, and then the Knights Templar, of course. And, of course, before it was called Washington, D.C. in 1871, it was Rome on the Potomac. And before they called it the Potomac, they called it the Tiber, which is the river in Rome. Our capital was named after the capital of the true rulers of the world. Unbelievable. Okay. In February 1871, he was advanced to the Select and Most Excellent Architect's degrees, and to the 4th and 5th degrees of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite in Mithras Lodge of Perfection number 2 in Washington. Wow. He was given the 6th to 13th degrees later in the same year by General Albert Pike, and received the final degrees in the Lodge of Perfection in January of 1872. Following his death, his body was accompanied from Washington to Cleveland, Ohio, by representatives of Columbia Commandery No. 2, where he was buried in the presence of a great concourse of Masons. You know what? There's Masons in my family from generations ago. My family member told me that one of them was, pretty high up in the lodge and loved it and was in it his whole life, and only one Mason showed up to his funeral. These people are sick. William McKinley, 24th President, March 4th, 1897 to September 14th, 1901. Few men, if any, have occupied the White House and served their country as chief executive who were more highly revered or more greatly loved than William McKinley. I wonder if the term chief executive... Well, I guess we always called it maybe we didn't always call it the executive branch. Maybe, I don't know. They rewrite history so often. Chief executive just sounds exactly like a corporation. Okay. Though a staunch Republican, he was respected and honored by the members of all political parties. He was in every sense of the word the president of the whole American people, as demonstrated in his 2 victories over America's greatest, commoner, and most popular orator, William Jennings Bryan. William McKinley was born on January 29th, 1843, at Niles, Ohio. Nile River. As a boy, he was given the best advantages available in his education, but he was forced to give up his schoolings because of poor health, and before he was able to resume his studies, the War of Northern Aggression broke out. Out of a sense of duty to his country and with complete disregard of his poor health, he enlisted in the 23rd Ohio Regiment in 1861 and fought through the entire Civil War, rising from a private to the rank of a major. Wow. Okay. McKinley was accepted, initiated, passed, and raised to the sublime degree of a master mason on 3 successive days due to war conditions. May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1865. May 1st, the day the Illuminati was formed in 1776, May Day. Classic. He demitted and later became affiliated with Canton Lodge No. 60, Canton, Ohio. On June 2nd, 1869, he became a charter member of Eagle Lodge No. 431. Down with the Eagle, anybody? Makes sense? Canton, Ohio as well. This lodge later changed its name to William McKinley's Lodge No. 431 in honor of this noted member. He was made a Royal Archmason by Canton Chapter No. 84, December 28, 1883, and knighted in Canton Commandery No. 38, December 23, 1884. On December 23, 1896, he was made a life member of Washington Commandery No. 1, Washington, D.C. He was made also an honorary member of the Illinois Masonic Veteran Association. While president, he reviewed 2 Knights Templar parades from the White House. Are you kidding me? There were Knights Templar parades down Pennsylvania Avenue. After these people had just slaughtered half of the country, they held Knights Templar parades. It's ridiculous. He visited his mother lodge at Winchester and participated in the Masonic Centennial of the death of our first president, George Washington. Deeply appreciative of Freemasonry in all of its notable degrees, he was always loyal and active in his Masonic career. Ridiculous, guys. Let's see who's next. Oh, Teddy Roosevelt. 25th president, September 14th, 1901 to March 4th, 1909. Teddy Roosevelt, as he was commonly known, was the most dynamic and spectacular man who has ever occupied the White House. Advanced to the presidency from the office of vice president as a result of the tragic assassination of William McKinley, and re-elected to succeed himself in the fall of 1904. He filled the office for more than 7 years. During this period, he faithfully performed his duties in an independent and sometimes in a dramatic and sensational manner, and he gained for himself the reputation of the most colorful of all presidents. He firmly opposed financial and industrial monopolies and gigantic business mergers. He created the Department of Commerce and was instrumental in the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act and the Pure Food Laws. It was during his administration that the building of the Panama Canal was begun, and he aided in effecting peace between Russia and Japan. So, a few things to talk about out of that. McKinley didn't just get assassinated. Come on, something happened. Wait, was he sick or assassinated? He was assassinated, right? I think it says up here. Yeah, assassinated. So, you're going to see during Teddy Roosevelt's years, expansionism and American imperialism. It's really the birth of it. It's pretty ridiculous. And, they just bury it under his affecting peace between Russia and Japan. But really, under Teddy Roosevelt is when you start to see the tentacles of the beast start to spread all over the world, like Panama, right? A lot of South American, Latin American, Central American countries, they were all affected by the rise of these Freemasons, and globalism really began. It also says that he was against financial and industrial monopolies, so say one thing, do another, right? Really, there's so many parallels between Teddy Roosevelt and Donald Trump. The exact same method is used by both presidents. They are masters of the bully pulpit, right? They know how to talk to journalists. They know how to talk to the American people. They know how to woo people and get people excited. It became a show, complete political theater. This is the rise of that. And then we're going to be reading about populism and progressivism, which come out around these times. Let's read his Masonic career. Theodore Roosevelt's Masonic career did not begin until after his election to the vice presidency. Upon reaching the age of 43, he was initiated, passed, and raised in Matinacock Lodge No. 806 in his home community of Oyster Bay, Louisiana. I think that is. January to April 1901. The degree work was performed by noted Grand Masters and past Grand Masters of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. His gardener Seaman was Worshipful Master. In 1904, he was made an honorary member of Penta Alpha Lodge number 23 of Washington, D.C. Throughout the remainder of his life, he was active in Masonic affairs, made many Masonic addresses, and often took part in Masonic ceremonies and in the laying of cornerstones of notable public buildings. Teddy Roosevelt died at his home. Oyster Bay, New York. My bad. I don't know what the L is in that sentence up there. So you see, even if you're not a Freemason, if you're vice president, you're a Freemason. They'll just skip all their degrees, give them all to them. Okay, William Howard Taft, 26th president, March 4th, 1909 to March 4th, 1913. No man has ever occupied the White House who served his nation in more widely diversified fields of activity and with greater distinction than did William Howard Taft. I believe wasn't Alphonso Taft his ancestor, the inventor of Skull and Bones at Yale? I think he was. Could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. He's the only man in American history who held successfully the two highest offices in the nation, those of President and of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In both of these positions, as well as in many others, he was highly accomplished and distinguished. He was truly one of the great men of our history. A man with a giant intellect, an unblemished character, a charming personality, and a store of learning and wisdom which encompassed every phase of human thought and attention. Notable among the achievements of his administration as president were the rigid enforcement of the Sherman antitrust law, the establishment of postal savings banks, and the regulation of railroad monopolies through the Interstate Commerce Commission. Yeah, so the opposite is true. Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft were in the same social class as the Rockefellers, as all of these Barron families, the railroad families, steel families, oil families. It's ridiculous. They were all in the same social class. They were all part of the same fraternity of Freemasonry. They were all sharing the same upper crust together. And to think that these people stopped anything from happening, to stop any of this evil from happening, is very naive. In fact, this is a time when these things grow the most, the monopolies and the trust and the holding companies. This is when all of that grows the most. And the politicians use the English language, like we talked about, to manipulate the public, just like they're doing today. And they end up passing laws that the public thinks are going to stop these things, but really just enable these things. It's unbelievable. Let's read about his Masonic background. Quite a lot. President Taft has the distinction of having been made a Mason at sight, a procedure not approved by some Grand Lodges, but universally accepted by Freemasons in the United States. This action took place at an occasional lodge on February 18, 1909 in the Scottish Rite Cathedral in Cincinnati, Ohio, by the Grand Master Charles S. Hoskinson. Guys, the Scottish Rite Cathedral. That is the most blasphemous thing I've read so far. Grand Lodge of Ohio. During the evening of the same day, President Taft witnessed the work of the Master Mason degree as a fellow brother was raised by the Kilwinning Lodge number 356 of Cincinnati, Ohio. He was later elected to full membership by this lodge April 14, 1909, a little over 1 month after his inauguration as president. 9 years later, on June 5, 1918, after he had delivered an address before the lodge, he was elected an honorary member of Crescent Lodge number 25 of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a lodge famous for the number of eminent Masons of its own state who have been on its membership rolls. On April 22, 1912, an elaborate memorial service was held by Temple Noyes Lodge number 32 of D.C. in honor of Major Archie Butt, who had perished in the Titanic disaster. More mockery. We're going to be learning about the Titanic today. President Taft, both as a friend of the deceased and a brother Mason, took part in this memorial service. They sacrificed those people, if it was even real. On June 15, 1910, he visited the famous American Union Lodge number 1 of Marietta, Ohio. He was present in the Washington Alexandria Lodge number 22 of Alexandria, Virginia, on the anniversary of Washington's birthday, February 22, 1911. On the following May the 9th, he posed for a picture in the White House wearing Washington's Masonic regalia. On May 13th of the same year, he joined in the celebration of the 150th anniversary of St. John's Lodge number 1, Newark, New Jersey. Most famous among William Howard Taft's Masonic activities was an address delivered before the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, December 27, 1914, in which he commented on the manner in which he had entered the fraternity. He expressed regrets that he had not followed the usual path, explaining that the exceptional mode in which he had been made a Master Mason had been due to circumstances over which he had no control. This is so dumb. William Howard Taft remained deeply grateful for the high ideals and principles of Freemasonry and was always proud of his membership in the fraternity. He died March 8, 1930, and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. You know what? Nobody skips a degree unless they become the president. Then they can get all 33 degrees. We'll make him a Freemason on sight. It's witches, dude. Warlocks. Okay. Warren Harding. 28th President, March 4th, 1921 to August 2nd, 1923. The services of Warren G. Harding as president are difficult of appraisement because they continued for a very short time. Following a tour of Alaska and extended tours throughout the West, he died of a sudden illness in San Francisco, August 2nd, 1923, just about 2.5 years after his inauguration. It has been contended that Harding was not fitted for the presidency, but it must be said on his behalf that he showed great wisdom in gathering about him some of the greatest national figures of our history, among them Charles Hughes, Herbert Hoover, and Andrew Mellon. Wow, Herbert Hoover, really. It was under his regime that the War Finance Corporation was revived, immigration was restricted, an emergency tariff law was put into effect, and the International Conference on the Limitation of Armaments was brought into being. Let's see what he's got going on with his, wow, a lot of Masonic stuff. During the last 3.5 years of Warren Harding's life, he was an enthusiastic and aggressive Mason and took part in a number of notable Masonic events. His Masonic career prior to 1920, however, has a strange and unusual feature that was never explained by himself or his friends. He was given the Entered Apprentice degree on June 28, 1901, in Marion Lodge No. 70, Ohio. Under the usual procedure, he would have never passed to the Fellowcraft within a month and raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason by the end of the second month. For some unexplained reason, a period of 19 years elapsed before he sought further light in the mysteries of Freemasonry. Okay, so instead of taking the first 3 degrees, the Osirian degrees, in 3 months, he waited 19 years. Wow. You know, if you watch Enter the Stars, there's a cycle regarding the number 19. There really is. There's some major event every 19 years, and it's probably because of the cycle of the moon. I'd imagine that's why they do this 19-year, basically false flag cycle, right? Okay, continuing. For some unexplained reason. Okay. On August 13th, 1920, a few weeks after his nomination for the presidency by the Republican Convention, he was passed to the degree of Fellowcraft, and on August 27th, he was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason. Between the period of his election in November 1920 and his inauguration on March 1921, he was advanced through the various degrees of all branches of the fraternity. So once again, there's honorary degrees because he's president. He was exalted a Royal Archmason in Marion Chapter No. 62, Marion, Ohio. That should tell anybody watching this that it has nothing to do with anything besides power. That's all it's about. And he was knighted in Marion Commandery, No. 36, March 1st, 1921. On January 5th, 1921, he received the Scottish Rite degrees from the 4th to the 32nd, inclusive, at Columbus, Ohio. So they just gave him 28 degrees at once. He was elected to receive the cryptic degrees in Marion Council No. 22, but he died before receiving them. On September 22, 1921, he was elected to receive the 33rd degree, but the conference of this degree upon him was delayed by the illness of his wife, and he died before another session of the Supreme Council of the Northern Masonic jurisdiction by which he had been elected was held. President Harding was a member of Aladdin Temple, Columbus, Ohio. Hence, he was the first president to wear the red fez. Almas Temple, Washington, D.C., elected him an honorary member March 21, 1921, and in June 1923 he was given honorary membership in the Imperial Council. He was also a member of the Grotto. We'll take a look at the structure of Freemasonry after this, but one of the cemeteries I can show you during this episode is full of Boston Brahmin, fez-wearing, 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons, and Grotto members of the Shriners. Okay, Harding was not merely a joiner of Masonic branches during this brief period of his career, but he was active in public services in various capacities. They're forced to be. On May 9th, 1921, he viewed a shrine parade in Washington, and on the same evening delivered an address during a special ceremonial at Alma's Temple. Think about that, a shrine parade. What is a shrine? Oh, it's just so pagan. These people are nuts. Okay. In 1923, he visited the Scottish Rite bodies of St. Augustine, Florida. On June the 5th of the same year, he delivered an address before the Imperial Council, nobles of the Mystic Shrine at Washington, D.C., and in July he officiated at the laying of the cornerstone of the Masonic Temple of Ketchikan Lodge number 159, Ketchikan, Alaska. It must be safe to say, then, that Warren G. Harding was tremendously impressed and affected by the beauties and glories of Freemasonry during those closing years of his life, and that he formed an indescribable attachment to Masonic principles and ideals. Of course, we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and yesterday we learned that Delano sat on the first board of the Federal Reserve in August 1914, and I'll show you in this again, the Delano House in Portland, Maine, has a Masonic doorway with Lucifer painted on it. There's no hiding it anymore. It goes without saying, of course, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was indeed the most popular of all the presidents of American history. In 4 successive elections, he was overwhelmingly chosen by the great mass of American voters to this high office. He was the second man of our history to seek a third term as president, and the first one to break the long-standing precedent which had limited the presidency of any one man to 2 terms. Not satisfied with having broken this precedent, he sought and received election to the 4th term, although he lived to serve only 3 months after his inauguration. You got to understand, by the time 1933, of course, by the time he became president, this whole Baphomet system was officially in place, and... Oh, hold on. Sorry, my screen closed. And what we see under his presidency is the most tremendous change this country has ever gone through. Everything changed. The welfare state was created. We socialized this country and gave the federal government so much power. And the reason he won with such an overwhelming percent of the vote was the Great Depression, right? It was the trauma of the Great Depression and the combination of the radio, which had just come out, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The radio and the effects of social engineering, the psychology, which was huge by this point. It was a new science, right? So all these things mixing together, psychology, radio, media, social engineering, trauma, depression, poverty, all of this stuff mixing together. It was a perfect storm that allowed Roosevelt to literally take all the liberty away. Bill after bill, New Deal law after New Deal law, federal government, bigger, 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 more welfare, more. And he went for 4 terms, and that should be a obvious expression of the power Freemasonry has to manipulate the public. Crazy. Got us in the World War II. Absolutely nuts. Okay. His first public office was in the State Senate of New York, where he displayed a politically independent spirit toward all issues. Let me just get to his Mason stuff. Roosevelt was an active Mason for more than 34 years, the 14th president who was a member of this honor fraternity. He was initiated October 10th and passed November 11th, 14th, and raised November 28th, 1911, first 3 degrees. In Holland Lodge number 8 of New York City, the same lodge in which the nation's first president, Washington, held honorary membership. He received the Scottish Rite degrees in Albany, New York, January 28, 1929. During his incumbency as governor of the state, he held membership in Cypress Shrine in Albany and was later made an honorary member of Alma's Temple, D.C. Although Roosevelt's public life was action-packed with multitudinous duties, he gave considerable service to Masonry. On November 21, 1919, he officiated at the laying of the cornerstone of the Masonic Temple erected by Stansbury Lodge No. 24, D.C., and was accorded honorary membership in this lodge just prior to his inauguration. He had the distinction of making his son, Elliot, a Mason in Architect Lodge No. 519, New York. Unbelievable. And delivered a notable Masonic address on this occasion. 21 months later, while still president, he attended Architect Lodge and presided over the 3rd degree ceremony in which 2 other sons, Franklin Jr. and James, were raised in the sublime degree of Master Mason. He was then made an honorary member of this lodge. These activities give unmistakable evidence of Roosevelt's faith in and devotion to the principles and ideals of Masonry. His staunch adherence to the ideals of the brotherhood of man, to the principles of fairness and justice for all men regardless of their station in life, were doubtless stimulated and strengthened by the influence of Freemasonry in his own life. Worldwide interest and worldwide unity in Freemasonry have received great impetus by the fact that Delano Roosevelt was a staunch member of the craft. So not only is Teddy Roosevelt a president, but then, next one in line, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president. And when we read the book about the Dulles brothers, you learn that Kermit Roosevelt, another Roosevelt in the CIA, originally OSS, was basically the chief operative on the ground when we overthrew the government of Iran in 1953. Like a James Bond. That's literally what he did with his life. So you can see how Masonry and these bloodlines connect all of these people together. And you go back to 1800, and Mr. Delano, all the ways back then, was profiting off of the Opium Wars in the 1800s and building houses and buildings in Portland, Maine. So the powers remained with these people forever. Like I said, I still got to do some more research into the Delano's association with the Opium Wars. I think Days of Noah, the channel I showed you, actually turned me onto that. So maybe I'll watch that. Okay. We got one more. So this one ends at Harry Truman, but basically every president after Harry Truman is a Freemason. Almost positive, including Donald Trump, I think. Harry S. Truman was advanced to the presidency April 12, 1945, following the much-lamented death of FDR. He was the 7th vice president to become president, and like most of the officers, he was confronted with many problems and difficulties. The whole world has never been in a more chaotic condition or faced greater problems than those which followed World War II, nor has there existed a more critical period in the history of America, largely because of the superior place that the United States held in the victory of the Allies against Germany and her satellites. It appeared necessary that she take the foremost place in the solution of the problems of peace and reconstruction for a devastated and wrecked world. This has been no easy task. In the congressional elections following Truman's inauguration, majorities for the Republican Party were elected in both houses, and it was difficult for the executive of the United States to carry out the policies of his party when forced to work with a Congress of the opposing party. Now, they use the word policies. I think that's intentional because Truman's famous for taking police action in Korea. Wasn't a war. Nope, wasn't a war. It was a police action. That's what they called it. And when you look at someone like Truman dropping nuclear bombs allegedly and then police actions in Korea, and you just see by Truman, it's a full-blown empire all over the world, especially after World War II. The greatest and most powerful physical empire in the world. Of course, Rome and London have their power as well, America being the muscle of this disgusting Baphomet system. But by the time Harry Truman's out of office, it's already settled. Look at the contrast. Think about it. Think like that Southern song we listened to in the beginning. The simplicity, the Judeo-Christian values of Southern life, right? The agricultural values, the living off the land, self-sustaining, it's gone. And by this time, about 100 years after the Civil War, we've gone from a nation of all values, Christian and Masonic, to a nation completely controlled by the synagogue of Satan with a fake pandemic. There's always been a fake pandemic. Once you get to the 1900s, it's always a fake pandemic. It's ridiculous. Okay, that covers our presidents. I'll take a quick break, and then we're going to talk about the political parties and read out of a book because we want to remember a lot of change. A lot of social engineering. Psychology is mainstream. Radio's coming out. So we really want to get an idea of what the political parties are saying and where they're at. So I'll be right back. All right. Next, we're going to read out of Documents of American History, edition number 6, 1958. So we're going to be talking about the rise of the Populist Party. And this will be easy to grasp because Trump is a very populist president. So is Bernie. Everything's falling over on me. But no, we live in an age of identitarian politics and populism, especially the big Mr. T. big time. So this is from July 4th, of course, right? The day honoring Sirius, the dog star, and its relation to Isis, the Egyptian goddess. July 4th, 1892. It's from McPherson, A Handbook of Politics for 1892, page 269. And it's called The Populist Party Platform. So think about what's going on today. This is 1892. Once Teddy Roosevelt gets in office, it really marks the beginning of political theater. By then, the age of transportation was like the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So this is 60 years after that. When you get to the 1890s, 1900, transportation, technology, electricity, the telegraph or whatever it's called, Morse code thing, all this technology was starting to pop up, and communication obviously became a lot faster. So you could do overnight news, you could do daily newspapers, and this was used by the people that we expose, and the people like Freemasons and, their control of the media and the government. It's used to make the craft. And this is when the craft becomes pretty hardcore. The craft, I think, is the matrix of deception. It's this, invented, created world that we live in through social engineering, through media, through books, and through what we're told by politics and phony religious leaders. So this is think about today when we talk about Teddy. So here's the preamble to the Populist Party platform. The conditions which surround us best justify our cooperation. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. That's a word I don't know. Talking about how everything's corrupt, right? Sound familiar? Sound like today? The people are demoralized. Most of the states have been compelled to isolate the voters at the polling places to prevent universal intimidation and bribery. The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled, public opinion silenced, business prostrated, homes covered with mortgages, labor impoverished, and the land concentrating in the hands of the capitalist. The urban workmen are denied the right to organize for self-protection. Imported, pauperized labor beats down their wages. A hiring standing army, unrecognized by our laws, is established to shoot them down, and they are rapidly degenerating into European conditions. The fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind, and the possessors of these, in turn, despise the republic and endanger liberty. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. The national power to create money is appropriated to enrich bondholders. A vast public debt payable in legal tender currency has been funded into gold-bearing bonds, thereby adding millions to the burdens of the people. Silver, which has been accepted as coin since the dawn of history, has been demonetized to add to the purchasing power of gold by decreasing the value of all forms of property as well as human labor. And the supply of currency is purposely abridged to fatten usurers, bankrupt enterprise, and enslave industry. A vast conspiracy against mankind has been organized on 2 continents, and it is rapidly taking possession of the world. If not met and overthrown at once, it forebodes terrible social convulsions and the destruction of civilization or the establishment of an absolute despotism. Oh my goodness. That sounds just like today. It's Revelation. They will speak the truth in these political writings, but they're not calling out the culprits. We know who the culprits are. It's the Holy See, the Vatican City, the City of London, which is its own country in London, and then, of course, the incorporated Washington, D.C., which, 19 years before this, there's your 21 years before this. Yeah, 21 years before this populist platform came out, they incorporated Washington, D.C., and this is all being carried out by the Templar, the Rose Order, the Royal Archmasons, Scottish Rite, York Rite, all these societies and fraternities. So just like today, they talk about the truth, but they're not going deep enough. Mr. T goes up on stage and talks about all the same stuff. A great conspiracy from Europe to America to take over the world, create a big despotism, have a big debt and, reduce everybody's worth and blah, blah, blah. but they never call out the culprits. And it's an example of how the Hegelian dialectic works, and we all know how that works now, right? They control both sides and form a synthesis of the two sides to create something new. Okay. We have witnessed for more than a quarter of a century the struggles of the two great political parties for power and plunder, while grievous wrongs have been inflicted upon the suffering people. We charge that the controlling influences dominating both these parties have permitted the existing dreadful conditions to develop without serious effort to prevent or restrain them. Neither do they now promise us any substantial reform. They have agreed together to ignore, in the coming campaign, every issue but one. They propose to down the outcries of the plundered people. With the uproar of a sham battle over the tariff so that capitalist corporations, national banks, rings, trust, watered stock, the demonetization of silver, and the oppressions of the usurers may all be lost sight of. They propose to sacrifice our homes, lives, and children on the altar of mammon, to destroy the multitude in order to secure corruption, funds from the millionaires. So they're appealing to people's religious beliefs, right? But we know that these Freemasons invert all the religious meanings to their own. Assembled on the anniversary of the birthday of the nation, or the anniversary representing Sirius, the dog star, symbolic of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, one of the gods in Freemasonry. Assembled on the anniversary of the dog star, Sirius, and filled with the spirit of the Grand General and chief who established our independence, the Grand General. What does that sound like to you? We seek to restore the government of the Republic to the hands of the plain people, with which class it originated. We assert our purposes to be identical with the purposes of the national constitution, to form a more perfect union and establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for our posterity. So you got to understand, this is only like 25 years after the Civil War. So the eagle is still completely in control. Remember, half of the house was gone, then we had Reconstruction and rebuilding the South, and the Union had total control over everything. They had total control over the South. They had total control over the government. So, we have to look at this and wonder if they're staging the left-right paradigm that we're so familiar with today. Okay. We declare that this republic can only endure as a free government while built upon the love of the people for each other and for the nation, that it cannot be pinned together by bayonets, that the Civil War is over, and that every passion and resentment which grew out of it must die with it, and that we must be, in fact, as we are in name, one united brotherhood of free men. Brotherhood. Dead giveaway. Masonic term. Grand General, brotherhood. Our country finds itself confronted by conditions for which there is no precedent in the history of the world. Our annual agricultural productions amount to billions of dollars in value, which must, within a few weeks or months, be exchanged for billions of dollars worth of commodities consumed in their production. The existing currency supply is wholly inadequate to make this exchange. The results are falling prices, the formation of combines and rings, the impoverishment of the producing class. We pledge ourselves that if given power, we will labor to correct these evils by wise and reasonable legislation, in accordance with the terms of our platform. We believe that the power of government, in other words, of the people, should be expanded, as in the case of the Postal Service, as rapidly as far as the good sense of an intelligent people and the teachings of experience shall justify, to the end of oppression, injustice, and poverty shall eventually cease in the land. Same exact words as today. While our sympathies as a party of reform are naturally upon the side of every proposition which will tend to make men intelligent, virtuous, and temperate, we nevertheless regard these questions, important as they are, as secondary to the great issues now pressing for solution, and upon which not only our individual prosperity, but the very existence of the free institutions depend. And we ask all men to first help us to determine whether we are to have a republic to administer before we differ as to the conditions upon which it is to be administered, believing that the forces of reform this day organized will never cease to move forward until every wrong is righted and equal rights and equal privileges securely established for all the men and women of this country. Wow. You could just make this a Mr. T speech. So now they're going to number some of their declarations here. Number 1, that the union of the labor forces of the United States, this day consummated, shall be permanent and perpetual. So, permanent labor unions. Second, wealth belongs to him who creates it, and every dollar taken from industry without an equivalent is robbery. 3, we believe that the time has come when the railroad corporations will either own the people or the people must own the railroads. Wow, call for socialism. There's nothing in the middle we could agree on. Okay, finance. 1, we demand free and unlimited coinage of silver and gold at the present legal ratio of 16:1. We demand that the amount of circulating medium be speedily increased, not less than $50 per capita. We demand a graduated income tax. We believe that the money of the country should be kept as much as possible in the hands of the people, and hence we demand that all state and national revenue shall be limited to the necessary expenses of the government. We demand that postal savings banks be established by the government for the safe deposit of the earnings of the people. Government-controlled bank. Sound good to you? Oh, man. Let's see. What is this? Expression of sentiments. Your committee on platform and resolutions beg leave unanimously to report the following. 1, resolve that we demand a free ballot and a fair count in all elections. What a joke. And pledge ourselves to secure it to every legal voter without federal intervention through the adoption by the states of the unperverted Australian or secret ballot system. 2, resolve that the revenue derived from a graduated income tax should be applied to the reduction of the burden of taxation now levied upon the domestic industries of this country. Yeah. 3, that we pledge our support to fair and liberal pensions to ex-union soldiers and sailors. 4, that we condemn the fallacy of protecting American labor under the present system, which opens our ports to the pauper and criminal classes of the world. So, a really interesting thing I have in a book down here talks about how immigration really only happened in the North. Literally, that's it. Nobody immigrated to the South. They all immigrated to the North to become free labor, as they called it, slaves in the industrial system. So the whole prospect of this slavery, Civil War thing, it's all backwards. Literally free labor. They would give you like a room with a bed, and you would work like 13 hours a day, and you own nothing, and they didn't really pay you because they were giving you board. Tons and tons of immigrants came to the North. So as we can see, the Progressive Party, it's like a mixture of Mr. T's populism with socialism a little bit. But the basic theme of all of these points is to expand the federal government. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, now we have the Republican platform of 1896. So let's check this out. This is from National Party Platforms, page 201. For the first time since the Civil War, the American people have witnessed the calamitous consequence of full and unrestricted democratic control of the government. It has been a record of unparalleled incapacity, dishonor, and disaster. In administrative management, it has ruthlessly sacrificed indispensable revenue, entailed an unceasing deficit, eked out ordinary current expenses, and borrowed money, piled up the public debt by $262 million. In time of peace, forced an adverse balance of trade, kept a perpetual menace hanging over the redemption fund, pawned American credit to alien syndicates, and reversed all the measures and results of successful Republican rule. In the broad effect of its policy, it has precipitated panic, blighted industry and trade with prolonged depression, closed factories, reduced work and wages, halted enterprise, and crippled American production, while stimulating foreign production for the American market. Every consideration for public safety and individual interest demands that the government shall be wrested from the hands of those who have shown themselves incapable of conducting it without disaster at home and dishonor abroad, and shall be restored to the party for which 30 years administered it will be unequaled success and prosperity. And in this connection, we heartily endorse the wisdom, patriotism, and success of the administration of Benjamin Harrison. Whew. Wow, calling him out, huh? That's pretty wild. Once again, though, this is the serpent. This is the snake. They're calling out the corruption. They're telling the truth. You know, they're making sure their karma is in order. They're letting you know these problems, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one was in power during this time because they all went forward with the Union platform. You got to remember, this is right after the Civil War, so sure, these people are elected in different states and represent different constituents in the country, but this is a group of men who fought a war together. So their oaths, their brotherhood, even without Freemasonry, it's an oligarchy at this point, right? So the populist platform is kind of like Mr. T, populism mixed with a little bit of socialism, government expansion. Sounds like the Republicans here are playing the role of small government. Let's continue. Let me get some water. It choked. We're good. Okay. We renew and emphasize our allegiance to the policy of protection as the bulwark of American industrial independence and the foundation of American development and prosperity. This true American policy taxes foreign products and encourages home industry. It puts the burden of revenue on foreign goods. It secures the American market for the American producer. It upholds the American standard of wages for the American working man. It puts the factory by the side of the farm and makes the American farmer less dependent on foreign demand and price. It diffuses general thrift and founds the strength of each. It is reasonable application. It is just, fair, and impartial. Equally opposed to foreign control and domestic monopoly, to sectional discrimination, sectional, not sexual, and individual favoritism. We denounce the present tariff as sectional, injurious to the public credit, and destructive to business enterprise. We demand such an equitable tariff on foreign imports which come into competition with the American products as will not only furnish adequate revenue for the necessary expense of the government, but will protect American labor from degradation. In the wage level, of other hands, we are not pledged to any particular schedules. The question of rates is a practical question to be governed by the condition of time and of production. The ruling and uncompromising principle is the protection and development of American labor and industries. The country demands a right settlement, and then it wants a rest. So, same thing they're talking about today, 125 years later, right? They're tariffs and talking about, protecting American-made industries, blah, blah, blah. Same exact platform. We believe the repeal of the reciprocity arrangements negotiated by the last Republican administration was a national calamity, and demand their renewal and extension on such terms as will equalize our trade with other nations, remove the restrictions which now obstruct the sale of American products in the ports of other countries, and secure enlarged markets for the products of our farms, forests, and factories. Protection and reciprocity are twin measures of American policy and go hand in hand. Democratic rule has recklessly struck down both, and both must be reestablished. Protection for what we produce, reciprocal arrangement of mutual interest, which gain open markets for us in return for our open markets for others. Protection builds up domestic industry and trade and secures our own market for ourselves. Reciprocity builds up foreign trade and finds an outlet for our surplus. The Republican Party is unreservedly for sound money. It caused the enactment of a law providing for the resumption of specie payments in 1879. Since then, every dollar has been as good as gold. We are unalterably opposed to every measure calculated to debase our currency or impair the credit of our country. We are therefore opposed to the free coinage of silver, except by international agreement with the leading commercial nations of the earth. Which agreement we pledge ourselves to promote, and until such agreement can be obtained, the existing gold standard must be maintained. All of our silver and paper currency must be maintained at parity with gold. And we favor all measures designated to maintain inviolable the obligations of the United States, of all our money, whether coin or paper, at the present standard, the standard of most enlightened nations of the world. We denounce the practice in the Pension Bureau so recklessly and unjustly carried on by the present administration of reducing pensions and arbitrarily dropping names from the rolls, as deserving the severest condemnation of the American people. Our foreign policy should be at all times firm, vigorous, and dignified, for all of our interests in the Western Hemisphere should be carefully watched and guarded. The Hawaiian Islands should be controlled by the United States, and no foreign power should be permitted to interfere with them. The Nicaragua Canal should be built, owned and operated by the United States, and by the purchase of the Danish islands, we should secure a much-needed naval station in the West Indies. So lots of good-sounding stuff, right? Lots of good-sounding stuff, but the same establishment we are dealing with today. They admit at the very end that they want to basically exercise their imperial power, take the Hawaiian Islands, build these canals, and that's what we're going to see during this time. We're going to see tons of global action, aggressive global action, and imperial stuff. That's when this really begins, right? And one thing I find interesting is that it sounds like the people really want silver, the money to be backed by silver as well. But the Republican Party is saying, no, we have to use gold. And why, what would be a sinister reason to do that? Well, there's much less gold in circulation, so that gold can be concentrated in a fewer amount of people, which it was. It was concentrated in the Rockefellers and the political elite up in New England area, actually across the country at this point. So, yeah, the Republicans want to stick with gold, and they want to expand the empire, pretty much. So populist, Republican. And now we're going to read the Democrat Party platform, Chicago, July 8th, 1896. Okay. Title is The Money Plank. Recognizing that the money question is paramount to all others at this time, we invite attention to the fact that the federal Constitution named silver and gold together as the money metals of the United States, and that the first coinage law passed by Congress under the Constitution made the silver dollar the monetary unit and admitted gold to free coinage at a ratio based upon the silver dollar unit. Little background, that's good. We declare that the Act of 1873, demonetizing silver without the knowledge or approval of the American people, has resulted in the appreciation of gold and a corresponding fall in the prices of commodities produced by the people, a heavy increase in the burdens of taxation and of all debt, public and private, the enrichment of the money-lending class at home and abroad, the prostration of industry and impoverishment of the people. So all of these parties are saying the same thing when it comes to money being worth less, debt going up, and opportunity and labor being used, just not there. Labor is worth nothing. We are unalterably opposed to monometalism, which has locked fast the prosperity of an industrial people in the paralysis of hard times. Gold monometalism is a British policy, and its adoption has brought other nations into financial servitude to London. What have we been saying? The Holy See is the spiritual leader of this Baphomet Luciferian global system. The City of London, which is a corporation, is the financial center. And the Democrat Party platform saying right here that this whole switch from silver to gold is the work of London. And it causes countries to go into financial servitude to London in the banking system, the Rothschilds, right? It is not only un-American, but anti-American, and it can be fastened on the United States only by the stifling of the spirit and love of liberty, which proclaimed our political independence in 1776 and won it in the War of the Revolution. Remember, 1776, also the founding year of the Illuminati. And can you see how this is theater? How they're playing both sides? It doesn't matter what side's going to win. They're going to move forward with gold at the moment and then the Federal Reserve in 1913. So, unbelievable. And remember, we're dealing with the winning faction of the War of Northern Aggression still. This is only 1896, right? So it doesn't matter Democrat, Republican, progressive, populist. They're all on the same team. They're all the winners of that massive war that destroyed half the country. So, yeah, let's continue. We demand the free and unlimited coinage of both silver and gold at the present legal ratio of 16 to 1, without waiting for the aid or consent of any other nation. See how that would like drive up your emotion? That's exactly what the people want. They'd be like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what we want. That's what we need. Ugh. Okay. We demand that the standard silver dollar shall be a full legal tender, equally with gold, for all debts public and private, and we favor such legislation as will prevent for the future the demonetization of any kind of legal tender money by private contract. We are opposed to the policy and practice of surrendering to the holders of the obligations of the United States the option reserved by law to the government of redeeming such obligations is either silver coin or gold coin. Interest-bearing bonds. We are opposed to the issuing of interest-bearing bonds of the United States in time of peace, and condemn the trafficking with banking syndicates, which, in exchange for bonds and at enormous profit to themselves, supply the federal treasury with gold to maintain the policy of gold monometallism. Remember that, monometallism. I've never heard that before, but one type of metal for currency, just gold. So yeah, 1873 was when they started demonetizing silver. That's wild. Let's continue. Against national banks. Congress alone has the power to coin and issue money, and President Jackson declared that this power could not be delegated to corporations or individuals. We therefore denounce the issuance of notes intended to circulate as money by national banks as in derogation of the Constitution. And we demand that all paper which is made a legal tender for public and private debts or which is receivable for dues to the United States shall be issued by the government of the United States and shall be redeemable in coin. Wow. So this is so sad because they're saying President Jackson declared that this power, the power to make a corporation, could not be that's not a power of the Constitution. The Constitution does not allow the government to make a corporation or a national bank. But, what is this, 1896? We see that in 1913, not too long after this, like 16 years later, that is exactly what would happen. And they were able to do that because in 1871, they incorporated Washington, D.C. as a government, as a corporation. They created a invisible governing entity, and that is how they were able to create the Federal Reserve, because it wasn't the Republic of the United States government creating the Federal Reserve. It was the corporation of the government of Washington, D.C. that was responsible for it. Okay, what else they say? Let's see. Sympathy for Cuba. The Monroe Doctrine, as originally declared and as interpreted by succeeding presidents, is a permanent part of the foreign policy of the United States and must at all times be maintained. We extend our sympathy to the people of Cuba in their heroic struggle for liberty and independence. We were all over the place during this time. So yeah, the Democrat Party, once again, we have some more. Let's read Tariff Resolution. We hold that tariff duties shall be levied for purposes of revenue, such duties to be so adjusted as to operate equally throughout the country, and not discriminate between class or section, and that taxation shall be limited by the needs of the government. The Democrats saying that, right? Wow. That taxation shall be limited to the needs of the government, honesty, and economically administered. Honestly and economically administered. We denounce as disturbing to business the Republican threat to restore the McKinley Law, which has twice been condemned by the people in national elections, and which, enacted under the false plea of protection to home industry, proved a prolific breeder of trust and monopolies, enriched the few at the expense of the many, restricted trade, and deprived the producers of the great American staples of access to their natural markets. Classic. Let's see what they say about trust and pools, so like monopolies, right? The absorption of wealth by the few, the consolidation of our leading railroad systems, and the formation of trust and pools require a stricter control by the federal government of those arteries of commerce. We demand the enlargement of the powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission and such restriction and guarantee in the control of railroads as will protect the people from robbery and oppression. So there you have it. What do all of these parties have in common? Increasing the power of the federal government in the economy and in the affairs of people. Federal interference in local affairs. So here's where they're going to say the opposite of what we just explained. We denounce arbitrary interference by federal authorities in local affairs as a violation of the Constitution of the United States and a crime against free institutions, and we especially object to government injunction as a new and highly dangerous form of oppression by which federal judges, in contempt of the laws of the states and rights of citizens, become at once legislators, judges, and executives. And we approve the bill passed at the last session of the United States Senate and now pending in the House of Reps relative to contempt in federal courts and providing for trials by jury in certain cases of contempt. So just more dualism, the complete opposite of what they're going to do, right? They want the federal government to be larger. So yeah, that's the theme we're getting out of all of this. Remember, these guys are all union guys, they're all on the same team. A lot of these politicians have been in politics since that time, since the Civil War, and they're single-minded in their philosophical and religious beliefs. They're members of secret orders, fraternities, Freemasons, Brahmin Society, all sorts of groups. And so the goal is power. And what all those parties offer are different routes to the same thing. That's what the Hegelian dialectic really is, right? You distract the people by dividing them. Divide them on certain issues, when in reality, they're not paying attention to the fact that all three platforms call for deprivation of rights and the increase in the federal government, increase in the government's role in the economy. And the same thing happens today. It's not even, back then it was even, I think, more obvious, it seems, right? Today they have to hide it. Okay, Platform of the American Anti-Imperialist League, October 18th, 1899. Written by Schertz, Speeches, Correspondence, and Political Speeches, Volume 5, page 77. So, I've mentioned a few times, this is when the tentacles of the beast, the real Kraken, start extending all over the world, and we start acquiring territories, whether it's Alaska, Hawaii. We start messing around in Cuba, building the Panama Canal. Like, we had to, I'm pretty sure it was Colombia, we had to cause a revolution in Colombia to get that territory because, correct me if I'm wrong, Colombia didn't want to offer that land to build the canal. So Panama was created through covert insurrection. And, of course, you have the Spanish-American War, and we're in the Philippines at this point. So naturally, there was people that were against this. So this is the platform of the Anti-Imperialist League. We hold that the policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty and tends towards militarism, an evil from which it had been our glory to be free. We regret that it has become necessary in the land of Washington and Lincoln to reaffirm that all men, of whatever race or color, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We maintain that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. We insist that the subjugation of any people is criminal aggression and open disloyalty to the distinctive principles of our government. We earnestly condemn the policy of the present national administration in the Philippines. It seeks to extinguish the spirit of 1776 in those islands. We deplore the sacrifice of our soldiers and sailors, whose bravery deserves admiration even in an unjust war. We denounce the slaughter of the Philippines as a needless horror. We protest against the extension of American sovereignty by Spanish methods. Sound familiar, guys? Endless wars. That's what was happening during this time, too. Endless wars all over the world. Little ones, but nonetheless, the ones today are little, too. Same thing. People are still wrongly being slaughtered by America for years on end. Let's continue. We demand the immediate cessation of the war against liberty, begun by Spain and continued by us. We urge that Congress be promptly convened to announce to the Filipinos our purpose to concede to them the independence for which they have so long fought, and which of right is theirs. The United States have always protested against the doctrine of international law, which permits the subjugation of the weak by the strong. A self-governing state cannot accept sovereignty over an unwilling people. The United States cannot act upon the ancient heresy that might makes right. You know, it's sad because the truth is we are that nation. We are part of international law. We were created by internationalists. Let's continue. Imperialists assume that with the destruction of self-government in the Philippines by American hands, all opposition here will cease. This is a grievous error. Must, as we abhor the war of criminal aggression in the Philippines, Greatly as we regret that the blood of the Filipinos is on American hands, we more deeply resent the betrayal of American institutions at home. The real firing line is not in the suburbs of Manila. The foe is on our own household. The attempt of 1861 was to divide the country. That of 1899 is to destroy its fundamental principles and noblest ideas. Wow. What did this just say? This just said our real enemy is in our own government. And that enemy is responsible for 1861, for the Civil War. And that same enemy is responsible for the events going on in the Philippines in 1890s, almost 1900. So this document's openly admitting that there is this entity that is responsible for these things inside the government, an enemy of our republic inside the government. Just like Charles Adams warned in 1868 or 69. The real firing line is not in the suburbs of Manila. If you don't know, Manila's in the Philippines. The foe is our own household. The attempt of 1861 was to divide the country. That of 1899 is to destroy its fundamental principles and noblest ideas. The author doesn't talk about territory. He's talking about dividing the people. And now, in 1899, it's time to destroy the fundamental principles and the noblest ideas of our country. This has been happening the whole time, guys. This is wild. Let's continue. Whether the ruthless slaughter of the Filipinos shall end next month or next year is but an incident in a contest that must go on until the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are rescued from the hands of their betrayers. Those who dispute about standards of value while the Republic is undermined will be listened to as little as those who would wrangle about the small economies of the household while the house is on fire. The training of a great people for a century, the aspiration for liberty of a vast immigration are forces that will hurl aside those who in the delirium of conquest seek to destroy the character of our institutions. We deny that the obligation of all citizens to support their government in times of grave national peril applies to the present situation. If an administration may, with impunity, ignore the issues upon which it was chosen, deliberately create a condition of war anywhere on the face of the globe, debauch the civil service for spoils to promote the adventure, organize a truth-suppressing censorship, and demand all the citizens a suspension of judgment and their unanimous support, while it chooses to continue the fighting, representative government itself is imperiled. Wow. This is 1899, you guys. That is exactly the same list that John Quincy Adams wrote in 1829, 1830. And what those authors of the anti-Masonic Republican Party wrote. That's what they were talking about. We have to read this again because I kind of messed up reading it. But it's being said perfectly right here. Let's break it down. We deny that the obligation of all citizens to support their government in times of grave national peril applies to the present situation. If an administration may with impunity ignore the issues upon which it was chosen, okay, so that's exactly what they do today, right? They ignore everything. They lie on the campaign, and then they ignore all the true things they said they were going to do. Classic. That's the first listed thing. Then deliberately create a condition of war anywhere on the face of the globe. Sound familiar? Yeah. Debauch the civil service for spoils to promote the adventure. And that's really what we're going to learn from Smedley Butler when he talks about how people made money off of World War I, which would come 15 years after this was written. So they use civil service, they use the defense industry, they use contracting, all this mumbo-jumbo crap that, the regular people don't understand to make money. War is a racket. And that's what they're saying, the Anti-Imperialist League right here. They're saying they debauch the civil service for spoils to promote the adventure. Then it says they organize a truth-suppressing censorship and demand of all citizens a suspension of judgment and their unanimous support while it chooses to continue the fighting. Representative government itself is in peril. Sounds exactly like today. So they censor the truth, and then they tell all of us to come together, unify, support. That's actually what they're doing right now. The Super Bowl this year, all the commercials are going to be about unity and stuff, they said. It's going to be ridiculous. But yeah, they divide. Now they're trying to synthesize the two sides into one. This is Hegelian dialectic 101. Okay, let's continue. We propose to contribute to the defeat of any person or party that stands for the forcible subjugation of any people. We shall oppose for reflection all who in the White House or in Congress betray American liberty in pursuit of un-American gains. We still hope that both of our great political parties will support and defend the Declaration of Independence in the closing campaign of the century. We hold with Abraham Lincoln that no man is good enough to govern another man without that man's consent. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. Our reliance is in the love of liberty which God has planted in us. Our defense is in the spirit which prizes liberty as the heritage of all men in all lands. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. We cordially invite the cooperation of all men and women who remain loyal to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Yeah, no wonder they didn't last too long, right? It sounds like a bit of actual organic resistance against this ridiculous plan that was being carried out by both parties. And they admit in that. He said, we hope both parties can wake up and stay true to the Declaration, but wouldn't happen. I'm not going to read it, but we have the Gold Standard Act of 1900. So remember what we said? Silver being used as currency was great because there's so much silver. And the common man, the poor man, can have silver, right? It allows the wealth to be in the hands of the person, to physically be in the vault of a bank, right? In a community, away from the federal government. When they enacted the gold standard before the Federal Reserve, they were absorbing and collecting all of that wealth, not through the government taking it. They were collecting it through industry, and industry being in bed with the government, and all of these people being members of the same brotherhoods, fraternities, and groups. Okay, let's see here. Let me find something. I got a lot of bookmarks. We're not going to read everything. Okay, 1903, there's a convention for the construction of the Panama Canal, right? Remember what I said? They had to create Panama in order to create the Panama Canal. Let's see here. Okay, so this is 1904, 1905, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I just want to read a little bit of this because Roosevelt is kind of like a Trump, right? And this is the age of imperialism for America. So we're going to read how this Freemason tries to justify the actions of the United States. Okay, it is not true that the United States feels any land hunger or entertains any projects as regard... Let me start over. It is not true that the United States feels any land hunger or entertains any projects as regards to other nations of the Western Hemisphere, save such as are for their welfare. So we're not messing with any countries. We're doing it for them, only if they need it, right? All that this country desires is to see the neighboring country stable, orderly, and prosperous. Any country whose people conduct themselves well can count upon our hearty friendship. If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters. If it keeps order and pays its obligations, it needs fear no interference from the United States. Chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in the general loosening of the ties of civilized society may in America as elsewhere ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Oh my God. It's not that we want to. We just have to. So it's so open back then. They're saying that even when countries around us are just acting with impotence, acting uncivilized, it's our duty as a civilized nation to be a police power. That's what Teddy's saying, big populist. If every country washed by the Caribbean Sea should show the progress in stable and just civilization with which the aid of the Platt Amendment Cuba has shown since our troops left the island, and which so many of the republics in both Americas are constantly and brilliantly showing, all question of interference by this nation with their affairs would be at an end. Our interests are those of our southern neighbors, and those of our southern neighbors are in reality identical. They have great natural riches, and if within their borders the reign of law and justice obtains, prosperity is sure to come to them. While they thus obey the primary laws of civilized society, they may rest assured that they will be treated by us in a spirit of cordial and helpful sympathy. So Cuba was needed for its sugar, because sugar's a drug, and sugar fuels, sugar fuels America, truly. Cuba was needed for sugar, and it was, where did they do all that banking offshore today? Cayman Islands or something? Cuba was like a Cayman Islands for quite some time before the uprising. Yeah. A lot of offshore business went on there. Okay. We get that. So it's very obvious back then when they write it. They're not even hiding it. If you people act uncivilized in our hemisphere, we will be a world police force. Why would Roosevelt use that language? Because that is the literal truth coming from the Holy See in the City of London, the Illuminati, the Synagogue of Satan, the head of Freemasonry, head of the Jesuits, all of these groups. America's role is and always was to be the police force of this global governing Luciferian system. So yeah, you better believe Harry Truman, Teddy Roosevelt are going to step out onto the pulpit and say, the bully pulpit, and say, we are a world police force, just like presidents today do. They try to dress it up with their Masonic witchcraft and magic, but it's ridiculous. All right, now we'll read a little bit of this. We have the Socialist Party platform of 1912. Socialism is another phase of the Hegelian. Is it dialect or dialectic? I don't know. It's another aspect. The next chapter of the Hegelian story in America will be socialism versus capitalism. They switched it up, right? It was imperialism and anti-imperialism beforehand. It was introduced because this was going to be the most important political idea during the 20th century. And they were behind socialism and capitalism and all the war that resulted from it. It was caused by the same groups. It's ridiculous. Socialist Party platform, Indianapolis, Indiana, May 12th, 1912. The Socialist Party declares that the capitalist system has outgrown its historical function and has become utterly incapable of meeting the problems now confronting society. We denounce this outgrown system as incompetent and corrupt and the source of unspeakable misery and suffering to the whole working class. Under this system, the industrial equipment of the nation has passed into the absolute control of a plutocracy, which extracts an annual tribute of hundreds of millions of dollars from the producers. Unafraid of any organized resistance, it stretches out its greedy hands over the still underdeveloped resources of the nation: the land, the mines, the forests, and the water, powers of every state of the Union. In spite of the multiplication of labor-saving machines and improved methods in industry, which cheapen the cost of production, the share of the producers grows ever less, and the prices of all the necessities of life steadily increase. The boasted prosperity of this nation is for the owning class alone. To the rest, it means only greater hardship and misery. The high cost of living is felt in every home. Millions of wage workers have seen the purchasing power of their wages decrease until life has become a desperate battle for mere existence. This goes on for a while, and they list off some points, but there's a lot of truth. They're speaking tons of truth, right? Because those were the conditions of these free labor slaves. A lot of them immigrants that came over and didn't receive money. They literally were slaves after a civil war allegedly was fought to end slavery. So this really was a horrible time. And of course, free blacks from the South migrated north as well to fill those positions too. And this was ruthless, ruthless capitalism. This was the seizure of gold, the seizure of power, the seizure of territory, and the creation of imperialism, all happening in like 4 decades after the Civil War. Soon as the Civil War was over, everything was put in motion to begin creating an empire. And now we're about to get to the times of World War I. And, we'll get into that a little bit. But I think lastly, for these political platforms, we're going to read the Progressive Party platform, August 5th, 1912. Okay. The conscience of the people in a time of grave national problems has called into being a new party, born of the nation's sense of justice. We of the Progressive Party here dedicate ourselves to the fulfillment of the duty laid upon us by our fathers to maintain the government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose foundation they laid. The old parties. Political parties exist to secure responsible government and to execute the will of the people. From these great tasks, both of the old parties have turned aside. Instead of instruments to promote the general welfare, they have become the tools of corrupt interest, which use them impartially to serve their selfish purposes. Behind the ostensible government sits enthroned an invisible government, owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people. Wow. Wow. To destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics is the first task of the statesmanship of the day. The deliberate betrayal of its trust by the Republican Party, the fatal incapacity of the Democratic Party to deal with the new issues of the new time, have compelled the people to forge a new instrument of government through which to give effect to their will in laws and institutions. Unhampered by tradition, uncorrupted by power, undismayed by the magnitude of the task, the new party offers itself as the instrument of the people to sweep away old abuses to build a new and nobler commonwealth. So, we have three new parties. Progressive Party, Anti-Imperialist League, or Party. What was the other one? There was one more. But either way, what we're seeing here is that if the Civil War was a climax, in those decades after the Civil War is when we saw the synthesis of the two original parties, right? These Democrats and Republicans. They synthesized into one party with the goal of, collecting all of the gold, establishing a big government, establishing an empire, eventually establishing the Federal Reserve. And what this progressive thing is, the populist. Populist was the other one. Since that Hegelian dialect finished and the synthesis was done, which was, the corporation, what we call the deep state today, I guess. In the early 1900s, they start introducing the next Hegelian dialect. Do you see that? Populism versus progressivism. What is going on today? Populism versus progressivism. What else is happening? It's climaxing into something. Just like the Civil War was the climax of the last Hegelian dialect. You understand that? So after this climax, the progressive and the populist will be synthesized into one entity, thus allowing two new factions to be born, just like the phoenix, beginning a next dialect. It's sick. Absolutely sick. But that's what we're seeing in the beginning of the 1900s. These new ideas, they probably got laughed at a lot, and people probably thought, that this will never work, blah, 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 but they do, because they make them work. Okay, the rule of the people. Listen to some of these things. Equal suffrage. Corrupt practices. So yeah, they want equal suffrage. That's self-explanatory for women too. Corrupt practices. We pledge our party to legislation that will compel strict limitation of all campaign contributions and expenditures and detailed publicity of both before as well as after primaries and elections. Now, the one thing about suffrage is, of course, suffrage is great, but inside the corporation system created in 1871, having the right to vote signs you up to be part of that system. So when they allowed women to vote, society went from being taxed, mostly men being taxed on their labor, and women staying, out of that system. But when women gained the right to vote, they were introduced into the social. I don't think the Social Security system existed then, but you know what I mean. They were introduced into the federal government system created in 1871. Therefore, they could be taxed. So even though they call themselves a progressive party, these things that they're calling for are ultimately going to end with more power in the hands of the government, because that's what happens every time. So equal suffrage, how can you argue against equal suffrage? Well, you can't. That's why it's the perfect Trojan horse to sneak in taxing the other half of the population. Corrupt practices, of course. Publicity and public service. We pledge our party to legislation compelling the registration of lobbyists, publicity of committee hearings except on foreign affairs, and recording of all votes in committee, and forbidding federal appointees from holding office in state or national political organizations, or taking part as officers or delegates in political conventions for the nomination of elective state or national offices. The courts. The Progressive Party demands such restriction of the power of the courts as shall leave to the people the ultimate authority to determine fundamental questions of social welfare and public policy. To secure this end, it pledges itself to provide 1. That when an act passed under the police power of the state is held unconstitutional under the state constitution by the courts, the people, after an ample interval for deliberation, shall have an opportunity to vote on the question whether they desire the act to become law, notwithstanding such decision. Sounds great, right? But now they're talking about marrying the powers of the state and federal government legislatures, right? So a synthesis. It sounds like rights are being given, but rights are really being taken. 2, that every decision of the highest appellate court of the state declaring an act of the legislature unconstitutional on the ground of its violation of the federal constitution shall be subject to the same review by the Supreme Court of the United States, as is now accorded to decisions sustaining such legislation. It's a trick. It's a snake. It's a serpent. So there's nothing a community can't figure out itself, and there's nothing a true republic state shouldn't be able to figure out itself. So what the Progressive Party is calling for is they're calling for disputes to be settled by the Supreme Court. So you just went from a state of millions of people to having 9 people decide the answer on super serious, super big topics like abortion, right? That's how this works. And what they do is they infiltrate the communities of the constituents and they influence them to have their own little mini dialectic, their own little mini Hegelian dialectic, where they both become divided, they can't come to a conclusion, goes up to the Supreme Court rules in favor of the federal government becoming stronger. Administration of justice. We believe that the issuance of injunctions in cases arising out of labor disputes should be prohibited when such injunctions would not apply when no labor disputes existed. We believe also that a person cited for contempt in labor disputes, except when such contempt was committed in the actual presence of the court, or so near thereto as to interfere with the proper administration of justice, should have a right to trial by jury. They go on to talk about social and industrial justice, so a lot of workers' rights. So here's where we're going to get things like a minimum wage. More power to the federal government. A limited workday. More power to the federal government, because now the federal government needs to create an entity to oversee all the workers. You know what I mean? And they're about to list off a lot of stuff like that. The 8-hour workday was a Progressive Party. The abolition of convict contract labor system. That didn't go anywhere. Publicity as to wages, hours, and conditions of labor, full reports upon industrial accidents and diseases, and the opening to public inspection of all tallies, weights, measures, and check systems on labor products. So now the government can kick open the door and do whatever they want, basically, to make sure you're in line with, the workers' rights. That's what they'll say. Standards of compensation for death, the protection of home life against the hazards of sickness. So now, standards of compensation for death. So think about this, like somebody dies on the work site, and of course they should be compensated, the family should be, but who's going to step in to do that compensation? The giant corporations, and their lawyers are going to be the ones that work with the businesses. So you see how it's just tying everything together? It's weaving the web, as the Freemasons call it. The development of the creative labor power of America by lifting the last load of illiteracy from the American youth. Of course, we need more slaves, so they need to know how to read because times are changing. The establishment of industrial research laboratories to put the methods and discoveries of science at the service of American producers. Once again, now you're going to combine the colleges with the banks and the lawyers and the corporations and the companies and the regulatory boards and everything. They're just weaving a web, saying that now we need the government to establish industrial research laboratories. It's ridiculous. So they can engineer society on campus and then teach the kids the next room over the lies that they are creating. Let's see what they say about currency. The issue of currency is fundamentally a government function, and the system should have as basic principles soundness and elasticity. The control should be lodged with the government and should be protected from domination or manipulation by Wall Street or any special interest. We are opposed to the so-called Aldrich currency bill because its provisions would place our currency and credit system in private hands, not subject to effective public control. Yep. They have a section about conservation. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt was huge on conservation. Dollar diplomacy. Extract from the 4th annual message of President Taft. We just want to read an intro about it because it's a popular term. We should probably know what it is. American surplus capital had flowed largely into South American investments, but prior to the accession of Taft to the presidency, there had been little investment in China. The financing of Chinese development was almost entirely in the hands of the English. Okay, so more imperialism. And so Taft in this actually goes on to talk about how Central America needs our help in debt adjustment. So it's fascinating because turn of the century, early 1900s, we're, injecting ourselves into all these Latin American, South American countries. And when we talk about the power structure, the shadow government, especially in this book, hold on. In this book by Stephen Kinzer called The Brothers, it's about the Dulles brothers. One was the head of the CIA and one was the Secretary of State at the same time. And when they were young, when they were in their 20s, they worked for a Wall Street firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell still exists. It's one of the biggest donors to 2016 Hillary Clinton's campaign. Sullivan and Cromwell did the financial work, a lot of the dirty financial work for some of the U.S. corporations involved in Latin and South America. So the time we're talking about right now is when companies like U.S. Fruit are being established in places like Guatemala. That's why we're seizing territory, because we're seizing the resources down there. And who's doing this? People like the Dulles family, who are, as you can read in this book, basically bloodline royalty. And they go on to overthrow countries the rest of their life. That's what these two evil men do. And they get an airport named after them, Dulles International Airport. It's absolutely sick. They made their start at Sullivan and Cromwell, working with U.S. Fruit and all of these awful companies like Chiquita Banana, like that company. Yeah. Basically enslaving and forcing those countries to allow the U.S. to dominate their only valuable industries. They would go on to fund the Nazis all the ways up until 1940. One of these two brothers working at that, Sullivan and Cromwell. Zyklon B, the gas, that was the Dulles brothers organizing those deals. Getting raw material to Germany during the buildup, that was all done by Wall Street. That was done by the Dulles brothers and others. Absolutely sick. Disgusting. So yeah, all these justifications for imperialism is what this period is marked with. I think it's probably time to start looking at the Federal Reserve. I think it's about that time. Hold on. I'll show you one thing here. So this is the report of the Pujo Committee from 1913, 62nd Congress, 3rd Session, House Report number 1593, the concentration and control of money and credit. So to trick the American people, they have investigatory committees to look into these things and expose the truth, but, the reality is the Federal Reserve was being created at the same time as this. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt. Further, as heretofore shown, the members of this group, through stockholding, voting trust, interlocking directorates, and other relations, have become in some cases the absolutely dominant factor. In others, the most important single factor is the control of the following banks and trust companies in the city of New York. So listen to these numbers. These are all the trust and banks in New York City. Bankers Trust, $250 million. Garrity Trust, $232 million. Astor, remember the Astor family? We'll be reading about them. $27 million. National Bank of Commerce, $190 million. Liberty National Bank, $29 million. Chase National Bank, $150 million. Farmers Loan and Trust, $135 million. In all, 7 with total resources is $1,600 million. Woo! That's a lot of money. If there be added also the resources of the Equitable Life Assurance Society, controlled through stock ownership of J.P. Morgan, the amount becomes 2,104,000,000. So they're talking about how much wealth these small groups of people actually own. It's ridiculous, dude. Absolutely ridiculous. Okay, so now we're going to get into like the Wilson administration and the Federal Reserve, right? So it is a tough time for America. Let me pause for a second and clean up all these bookmarks that are all over the floor. I use tarot cards as bookmarks. And yeah, actually, you know what? We're going to upload this portion, and then I'm going to come back later and upload the rest. So let's just do a little recap since we're going to do an intermission. We just went over all the different platforms of government that evolved after the Civil War. Populist, progressive, anti-imperial, Republican, Democrat. We talked about the argument between silver and gold being used for currency. Ultimately, gold would win. And then after that, the Federal Reserve would win. And we'll talk about that next. We established that basically every president during this time was a Freemason. And we read all of their Masonic biographies from the Masonic Bible. So that's pretty conflicting. We have supposedly opposing groups that are all members of the same fraternity. We talked about the Hegelian dialect and how the Republicans and Democrats synthesized after the Civil War. Now they're introducing the populists and the progressives in the early 1900s. We talked about the imperialism in Latin America, in Central America, in the Philippines, all over the world. The tentacles of the real Kraken, right? Technology increased a lot as well. We talked about communication, and now the ability to get the news out to people every day. And of course, soon the radio would become a very important part of that. And all sorts of technologies were coming out in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Probably the most important and largest theme of this period from the Civil War to the early 1900s is the expansion of the federal government, especially through the Interstate Commerce Act and through, Supreme Court case after Supreme Court case ruling that the federal government needs oversight over these things. And of course, having military control of the South, they were able to pass all this and maintain influence in the government and never lose it. So yeah, lot of expansion of federal government into every industry, really. We were just reading about industrial research. They created organizations for farming science and all, just endless. And at this point, in the early 1900s, the country is thriving from the Atlantic to the Pacific. People are thriving. The average worker is working in miserable, awful conditions, basically working as slaves. And that's why the Progressive Party gained so much popularity. See how they do that? See how they can intentionally make conditions bad just to manipulate you into working for a certain political end, a certain political party? It's fascinating. So, when we get back, we got to talk about, we'll start with the Federal Reserve. I think that's a good place to start. And we have some more books too, so we'll be hopping around all sorts of different medium. And let me end. Okay, no, we're good. I'll be back. Take care.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.